Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
This is Season 4, Episode 11, Chinese Wall. This episode was written by Aaron Levy and directed by Phil Abraham, and it takes place in late summer in August. The episode opens with Peggy and Joyce after a day at the beach, and they're all piling into this small car.
Who should happen to jump in the car with them but Abe? Looks like Abe's none too unhappy to have this chance to get with Peggy again. Do you think this was contrived and part of a plan, or do you think it really was spontaneous as Abe claims in the scene?
I'm not sure. I don't know if it's that important. I think they're thrown together in this same group of people in Joyce's orbit, and I think there's definitely something there between them, and they're both interested in investigating. I think this meetup was always going to happen at some point.
And this meetup seems to go better than the prior ones because after the ride crowded in the Little Beetle, Abe's back at Peggy's apartment. He's staying the night.
And the work of this scene in the car, of course, is just to get Peggy and Abe in close proximity again. But I really like this glimpse of life outside the office for a different reason. We're used to seeing a certain kind of person in the 1960s, I think. But just like everybody in France isn't running around with a beret and a baguette all the time, and everyone in the 1980s wasn't wearing leg warmers, it's not just a choice between hippies hitching to California and Donna Reed. But that's what we're typically shown about the 60s. So I love this look at the real people. They're not rolling in cash, so they have to all jam into this tiny car. But they can go have fun just because they're young, and they're on their way to change, as people always are. But this is a point on the journey, and it captures that.
Yeah, agreed. And we see Peggy's liberation because she's free to hook up with Abe, and he fumbles the courtship a little bit in her apartment, but they seem to have a nice night together.
I don't think I've ever seen Peggy be this happy with a guy. I think she was into Pete, which, all the why, continues to puzzle me. But Peggy is a lot more confident here. She and Abe seem both to be on more of an equal playing field. And before in Peggy's relationships with men, it always felt like there was an imbalance of power. There was with Pete, there was with Duck. And then, of course, there was a relationship with Father Gill, even though that wasn't sexual, but there was a power disparity in their relationship until she distanced herself. And that also seems like a parallel where Don is with Faye, who's more of a work match for him than Betty ever could be. And here's Peggy with a guy who has his own interests and opinions. And he's also really into her because she has interests and opinions.
The next scene takes us to Ken and his fiancée Cynthia, along with her parents having dinner. Ken happens to bump into John Flory from BBDO, and it seems he's got some news concerning Ken's firm.
We get our first truth call out for this episode as Ken denies what his friend is telling him, that Lucky Strike is going to BBDO.
We can see this is pretty earth-shaking news for Ken because, like everybody else in a senior position, he's aware of Lucky Strike representing somewhere north of 2/3 of their revenues. So if this news is true, it is world-changing for the firm. And Ken ends up excusing himself from the meal. This is news that just can't keep, and he needs to go confirm whether it's true or not.
Yes, I think this episode is all about people balancing their personal and professional lives. Of course, that's a nod to the episode title. And we see Ken's work life invading, justifiably, I think, in this case, some of his personal world. We should point out that this is the first appearance of Larissa Olenek as Cynthia, Ken's fiancée. She voiced Icy in Nickelodeon's Winx Club, and she might be recognizable from 10 Things I Hate About You, Pretty Little Liars, or The Secret World of Alex Mack. Ray Wise plays Ed Baxter, Cynthia's father, and his career is so extensive. It's hard to choose what to name for him. He was in Twin Peaks, The Young and the Restless, Fresh Off the Boat, Good Night and Good Luck, and dozens of TV shows and films, all the way back to the TV series Dallas. Dale Waddington plays Lillian Baxter. You may have seen her in the TV series Julia, or Desperate Housewives, or The Young and the Restless. Tommy Dewey is Ken's friend John Flory, and you may have seen him in The Mindy Project, Casual, or voicing Stu in Rugrats.
Ken is excusing himself from what is clearly, an important family event, the dinner with his fiancée and her parents. But this news is so major, it really knocks down all walls and barriers to intruding on personal lives, which feeds right into the next scene where we see Ken has gone to the hospital where Pete Campbell is awaiting the birth of his child in his quest to seek confirmation that this news is true. And Pete is as gobsmacked as Ken was.
For all the one-upmanship between Ken and Pete in accounts, they both understand the gravity. This is a moment finally nobody is keeping score.
So who do they call? They call Don Draper at his apartment. He's in the midst of returning from an evening out with Faye.
So just to check this, Don and Faye are spending the evening together, but Don answers the phone. Ken left his fiancée at dinner, and Pete left the hospital where his wife is having their first baby. Well, her first baby. And Don leaves Faye here, who she already waited for him to come home, and they're all planning to meet in the office to figure out what's happening with Lucky Strike. Once there, they meet up with Bert, and Roger walks in, pretending not to know anything about what's going on. Maybe Roger hasn't lied about his identity to his family and friends for a decade, but the level of deception here is pretty impressive.
And Roger's fully committed to it. I mean, he almost reenacts his reaction to Lee Garner Jr. in the restaurant, only this time he does it around a fake phone call to Lee Garner while the rest of them, listen with bated breath. Just goes through the motions here in a very convincing way. So they all believe that he has in fact called Lee Garner and discovered the news along with them at the last second. And the irony of it all is when Roger hangs up, Pete consoles him by handing him a drink as if Roger is as shocked and stunned by this news as everybody else is, when we, the viewers, know Roger's been sitting on this news for quite some time.
There's another truth call out right there, too, as Pete hands him the drink and says, "It's true." I also wondered, while Roger, I'll have to look at this again, while Roger is doing the fake phone call, he has his thumb on the button so that there isn't actually a dial tone. And I wonder from his angle, because Bert is sitting behind the desk, I wonder if Bert can actually see that this is a pantomime that Roger's doing, and if he comes to understand what's really happening here before the rest of them.
If Bert looks down at it, I didn't notice it in the scene. I didn't look for it specifically, but I certainly didn't notice anything that led me to think that anyone was seeing through Roger's little trick.
Don is still talking like he's a man of action. We're getting on a plane to Raleigh tomorrow, he says. And he believes he can sweet talk them into staying. And while we're all slagging on Roger for his lie, you can always look over at Don Draper and remember his interview at the beginning of this season cost them High a lie. His identity theft lie cost them North American Aviation. His petulance cost them Janssen. And those first two were huge accounts, and if they'd kept those, the loss of Lucky Strike wouldn't be this catastrophic. So we think of Don Draper as winning accounts and being really successful, but his genius comes with a price, and I wonder how it nets out over time. And I wonder if his story, like Tony Soprano's vis-a-vis Dr. Melfi, is what kind of a difference does he make to the people around him, and has all of this been for good?
The irony, and I guess maybe the tragedy of this scene, is we can see them all trying to find some way of escaping this, some way of getting a revisit from American tobacco, some desperate denial of this awful news. Roger, on the other hand, has carried this news for several weeks and has moved through all those stages. So even as they're desperately trying to cling to something, anything to keep them afloat here, Roger's not very active in participating, other than to head off an attempt for anyone other than himself to go down to Raleigh-Durham the following day.
Dawn goes home where Faye is asleep. She looks really pretty in her pink dress, and it's a very soft look for her. She's usually got boundaries up in her clothing choices. Cara Buono, who plays Faye, was nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Guest Actress in a Drama for this episode. Remember, Randy Heller was also nominated for her role as Miss Blankenship for a prior episode, but Loretta Devine from Grey's Anatomy won that year.
The other notable thing for me in this scene is Dawn is just pounding back the drinks now. So if he was in a healthier state and somewhat on the wagon, he's very clearly off the wagon with the Lucky Strike news.
Also, it's important to note that Don tells Faye the truth. He never would have said that to Betty unless he needed it as some kind of a distraction. But he tells Faye, looks like Lucky Strike's going south. And we can see Faye looking out for him. She watches him pour a drink. She reminds him he needs to keep a clear head. And he has this line that sums up the whole problem for the agency. He says, "Every day, I tried not to think about what would happen if this happened."
Yeah, Faye's a good friend here, reassuring him that he's the most employable man on Madison Avenue. Don kind of rejects that thinking at all, just saying he's not at that point yet. But again, I think Faye is a great partner here, consoling him, being supportive in the moment. Don doesn't have a lot of friends like that. So, I think she's really his family in this place and moment.
I agree. Faye says Don is the most hireable man on Madison Avenue, and that might be true, but he won't entertain leaving. And I'd like to think it's loyalty, but I'm cynical enough to think he claimed he wanted to build something when he started their company, but it seems more like safety. At this company, he can bully Pete into dropping North American aviation so he doesn't need a security clearance. He can't do that kind of thing at a different firm.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. How much of this is Don just sticking with the familiar and the comfortable? And again, there's a growing list of people who are aware of his little secret, right? He's told Faye outright. Pete knows, Bert knows. There's a certain risk if he were to jilt or upset any of these individuals too much, they could use that information against him.
Back at the hospital, Pete is talking to his father-in-law. He asks if he can see Trudy, which is to his credit, but no one seems to think it's necessary for him to see her, even though it's his child and his wife in labor. In fact, Tom says he was at a ball game when Trudy was born. Of course, there are people who don't have maternity leave, much less paternity leave, and they have to work, especially with costs of a new baby. But it feels like one thing to say, I need to work to support the baby, so I can't take time off of work, as opposed to I was on the golf course or I was busy watching a ball game.
Yeah, but I don't judge the individuals so much. They all seem just wrapped up in this system, this culture, this approach to it where, yeah, the man, the father of the baby need not be present and often isn't present, and everyone else just goes along, with it, and that's the way it is. We saw that earlier with Betty when baby Jean was born. It is so different than today, at least in the United States. It's hard to get your head around. And when Pete's father-in-law tells him, "Oh, I was at a ball game," there's no shame about the way he tells it. He tells it very matter-of-factly. Just a couple generations now, we look at this as a foreign country.
Tom immediately jumps to the same place Faye did for Dawn. He pushes Pete to go work someplace else now that the business is going under. Pete really is loyal to his agency here. Tom is arguing that CGC and Ted Cha talk about him, but Pete recognizes that just like Duck, Ted's interest is more about wounding Dawn. And it's also probably true that Pete doesn't want to owe Tom any professional favors.
It's interesting how much Ted Shaw pops up over the course of this season. He casts a big shadow over this season.
Trudy's mother definitely seems to be judging Pete for leaving the hospital, though. Tom says, I found him down at the candy machines. And again, Pete asks to see Trudy, but he's told, why don't you go back to the candy machines? And I think she thinks he's been at the bar.
And that's not a bad assumption on her part, right? Like we know there's something else going on here with Lucky Strike. And he has been drinking, right? So he will smell of booze.
The next morning at Peggy's apartment, Abe is slow to leave, and she's not hurrying him out the door either. She says, I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this, which you could take, I think, as Catholic guilt about sex. But I think it's more about how Peggy perceives this relationship differently. She's free to be herself in a way she hasn't been in almost all of her other relationships.
Yeah, I think there probably is a bit of that Catholic guilt wrapped up in it. But, as per the commentary from Matt Weiner and Aaron Levy, it just seems like, she's sexually liberated. I think she's just a little embarrassed at, this physical, instinctual desire that she's manifesting.
So next, Roger pretended that he went to Raleigh, and now he's calling Bert to say there's no hope with Lucky Strike. He pretends like he's calling from Lee Garner Jr.'s office, but really, he's in a hotel room in the city. It's just getting more and more embarrassing for Roger.
There's a certain patheticness to him moping in the hotel room like a little boy. You sort of run away from the truth, and now it's catching up with him. Again, this is a senior leader of the firm, and this is how he's behaving in this moment. And really, his focus now seems to be on self-pity and damage control.
Meanwhile, the other senior leaders are back at the office, and they need to make an announcement to the firm. And Don looks absolutely sick as he stands between Bert and Pete. They're getting ready to make the announcement to the SCDP staff, and the creatives are all muttering predictions to themselves about what the announcement will be. Like, there's no champagne, so it can't be Bert's retirement.
I like their speculation too. None of them have the right speculation. So nobody guesses they've lost their majority of their business in one fell swoop. It's all, sort of more interesting, exotic rumors. So that's a fun scene. Don's pep talk here, it really is a pep talk. So it's clear that the message he wants to send is, business continues. We've got to be better than before. Things aren't over. We're not done. Nobody panic. I think depending on who you are in the audience, you may read that as, okay, great. Yeah, I'm motivated and inspired. Perhaps the more cynical or questioning members will start to wonder why we need a pep talk. I would figure anybody who's paying attention will have a good sense of just how critical this whale is.
Don's speech sounds a little manic to me. He doesn't have note cards, but he's so emphatic that it's like he's willing success to happen by the force of his words. He says, our work is thoughtful and effective, and we're going to push ourselves and overcome this, and it will be exhilarating. It's like a crabby parent on a vacation who's like, we're having fun, okay? And Don is maybe the only person in the room pretending that overcoming this is an opportunity for something exhilarating, I think. I mean, Roger's lie is the big lie here. But Don can slip on a lie like a new clean shirt. He's going to tell everyone everything's going to be okay and they need to move forward because that's what Don Draper says. And to be fair, there's not a lot else he can say to the company at this point. He might as well be upbeat, but it comes off false to me.
And into all this tension and concern strolls Peggy, coming in on cloud nine after her tryst with Abe. And she quickly gets read into the situation. And it's funny because she's so high and happy, she immediately assumes that, she's not allowed to be high and happy. So this had to be the bad news to offset the good news or the good experience she just had. So it's kind of funny how she personalizes it to her own life. Don quickly calls her and a number of other creatives into his office to catch them up on they need to work better than ever and they can't afford to lose anyone. And basically just to sort of focus that pep talk on his specific creative team.
Yes, Don's message is to tell all the creatives to yes, sir, the clients for the next few weeks, to take good care of them, be prepared, stay in regular contact. Danny is only worried about his own job because Danny. And as everybody else leaves, Don calls Peggy back to take the temperature and he asks, you're not worried? And that makes her ask, should I be worried? And Don is a little more honest with Peggy. He says, we don't even know how bad this is until Lane gets back. And this response, her upbringing, her guilt, she says every time something good happens, meaning Abe, of course, something bad happens, I knew I was going to pay for this. And I don't think you have to be raised Catholic to carry that sort of anxiety or imposter syndrome, this doubting whether you deserve good experiences. I think that's very relatable. But Peggy's choices are completely unrelated to this outcome. And she's going to carry a piece of that around with her anyway. I also thought this should be an episode about Lane in his element. And it looks like Jared Harris was filming a lot of stuff around this time and busy professionally as an actor, so they sent his storyline back to England for that. But he would be on a plane in a heartbeat. I'm about to spoil the ending of ER, so if you haven't gotten around to that since 2009, fast forward for just a minute here. But it is one of my all-time TV frustrations that Juliana Margulies and George Clooney don't come back from Mark's death. She named one of the twins after Mark's mother, and Doug was his best friend. Not even a cameo appearance. I mean, how dare these actors go off and have successful careers and not show up for the fictional worlds they make us care about, right? So this to me is not in that neighborhood, but still you feel Lane's absence here. So they did the best they could. They talk about him. They talk about calling him, but this is something. If Pete can leave the hospital while Trudy is giving birth, Lane would get on a plane and make it back to New York.
With regard to the actors, I was going to say it's too bad one of them wasn't played by David Caruso because I'm sure he's available for reasonable rate. The next scene has us back with Roger, feeling sorry for himself, still moping in the hotel room. And who does he call? He calls his family, not Jane, his wife, not Mona, his ex-wife. He calls Joan. And he fesses up to Joan, saying that he's actually in New York City. Joan has a very angry reaction to this. Both Roger knew the news and that this has all been a bit of a play for their benefit to this point. And now he's read her into the gritty reality of it all. If Roger's looking for a shoulder to cry on, Joan isn't providing it at this point.
At first, Joan shows him some sympathy, but after his confession, I don't think Roger's prepared for Joan to be professionally irritated with him. I think he tells her so she'll feel more sympathy for the burden he's been carrying. And I think he tells her because he's not the same kind of liar Dawn is. It's eating him up and confessing it feels better. But instead of commiserating, Joan is annoyed. And I mean, who could blame her? Roger tells her to meet him at his hotel because I guess he thinks it's such a turn on when he lies about losing their biggest client and whining about it.
You know, we've seen Joan needing a shoulder to cry on recently, and with the mugging and the pregnancy and the marriage issues, you know, she hasn't been at her best and she's needed support. And Roger has been supportive and probably somewhat a cause of some of her challenges. In this moment, she's all business and focused on the mission, which is saving the company, and they've got to have all hands on deck, all rowing in the same direction. So she really has no time for this personal break of Roger Sterling and his feeling sorry for himself, and then just his misrepresentation and lack of truth about, you know, what's been going on. And she really slams the door hard on Roger here that this isn't the time for this. And, you know, she's all focused on the professional side. Again, I think it shows the lack of seriousness in Roger that all he's trying to do is get with Joan at the hotel room. And he seems a little hurt and perplexed that she has no time for that.
Back in the creative lounge, Peggy's preparing for her Playtex presentation. And she says, Dawn always has this example at the end that's kind of poetic. And we can see again how much she emulates his technique and how she honestly evaluates her work. And it feels like she's getting closer to Dawn's level here as she's growing professionally. Then she shifts over from her professional mindset to remembering Abe when she talks about a woman's hands being soft enough to touch all the things she wants to touch. And right on cue, Abe shows up pretending to be delivering a package for her. And it's cute that he couldn't wait to see her again, and she's pretty happy to see him.
And I just love the comedy of Danny and Stan talking about how they're in the end times and women get sex crazed and have all this sexual energy. Stan says it's the last days of Rome. It's so goofy, but it's so funny because we, the viewer, know that that's not exactly what's taking place here for Peggy.
On the other side of the office, the account men are going through all their accounts in the conference room. Pete's asleep in a chair, having been waiting up at the hospital and up late for the Lucky Strike news. The dialogue is really sparse in this scene, but it works for the shorthand they have as colleagues do when they're in trouble. An ad man has died. Their plan is to go to the funeral and see if they can pick up clients. Stay classy. It's very tense and it's very believable.
And this shows a nice contrast to the pep talk that was given to the employees, because you want to stop any panic and having things start to spiral out of control. And as we can see here, as they discuss the clients and as Dawn actually takes a call with Glowcoat, this is exactly the death spiral fear, only on the client side, where they're trying to stem the losses and demonstrate that they remain a viable company and that the clients don't need to take their business elsewhere. a losing discussion as Dawn has with the guy Al Weaver from Glowcoat. But again, you can see they're trying to do damage limitation here and stop the bleeding. And after Dawn gets off the unsuccessful call with Glowcoat, he clobbers the Clio award and breaks the trophy. And again, Dawn grabs a bottle of booze after whacking the Clio award. So he is definitely off the wagon at this point under the stress and pressure of salvaging this business.
Glowcoat is the perfect client to see leaving because it feels like they owe him some goodwill. But if they'll take off, you can see how fast the others might.
And then we've got this interaction at the end of the scene where Megan comes in and Dawn realizes he's backsliding now in terms of the drinking. He tells her to stop him from overdoing it on the booze. And he holds up the glass and says, "This is one of three." And somehow Megan can help him monitor and control this impulse and this urge in this moment.
Yes, I'm not sure Megan is enough to stop him, but at least he's trying for some accountability in the middle of this crisis. He's not abstaining, but he's trying to keep himself from going under. After the company announcement, we heard Fred Rumson say, "I need to go to a meeting." So it shook him up, and he's not even a partner. Don should probably be going to a meeting, but at least he's trying here.
I like the writing here too, because it feels very true to me. Many of us have fought addiction, and you don't always get to face it at your best, where everything else is sorted out and going the way it's supposed to so that you can focus on it. The addiction lurks. And then when other obstacles pop up or setbacks hit you, then the addiction is there to jump on you and take advantage. And suddenly that becomes a very tall mountain to climb.
Yes, great point. Don returns to the conference room where Pete is talking about Trudy being in labor, and Don blames Pete, being distracted, for Glowcoat dropping out. He's just angry. It's completely illogical. But isn't this Don being a bully like Lee Garner Jr.? I mean, he can make Pete drop North American Aviation, an account Pete's been building for years, just for his personal needs. So now, Don can come in and blame Pete for losing Glowcoat just to make himself feel better, and this bully knows Pete won't fight him on it. And I know we hit Don's integrity in other areas, and I know Pete is not the sweetest guy. But how contemptible is Don for blaming Pete in front of everybody else for this? And worse, to make it an insult that his wife is having a baby and that's what matters to him over work. Do better, Don. This is terrible leadership.
Yeah, it's not Dawn at its best. And to me, it's a bit of an echo of when Roger jumps on Pete about North American Aviation. And we as viewers know this has nothing to do with Pete losing the account. He's just falling on the sword. In this case, it's not clear. Did Pete do a lousy job of reassuring Glowcoat earlier in the day and spook them and scare them as Dawn accuses him? Perhaps. But to your point, it's not a place for Dawn to just throw that assertion out and say, "Oh, why don't you go to the hospital? That's obviously what you care about." I mean, that's a mean personal shot. Dawn's feeling the pain. He's just come off the call. This thing is starting to slide out of control, it feels like. And, as you mentioned, if you can lose the client for which you won the Clio and everybody's praising this amazing ad, no client is safe at this point. Uh, Pete does stand up for himself here, though. He sort of says, "Look, who do you think you're talking to?" And he walks out of the meeting. That's really all he can do in this circumstance. But I like that at least he wasn't sort of passively just taking this, verbal abuse from Dawn. I think of Dawn as has half an hour to cool down. He probably doesn't do this, but coming straight from his office into the meeting, he's looking to lash out, and he lashes out at Pete Campbell, who, to your earlier point, 9 times out of 10, I think Pete's face is exactly the one you want to lash out at. But in this particular case, it's not warranted.
So Pete goes back to the hospital, and Ted Chaw is sitting with his in-laws, every bit the smooth-talking car salesman, and he's ready to bring Pete on board as CGC. I noticed that Ted says Jim Cutler is due to retire here, but spoiler, everybody, so fast forward a second. We're going to see Jim Cutler in a few seasons, so apparently Ted has that argument wrong, or it doesn't even matter as he's trying to make this pitch to Pete. And what did you think of Ted's argument here to Pete?
Well, I just think he's making the hard pitch right now. And he's going all in on this. This is a chance to take a big bite out of Draper's business. It seems like Ted has, at least from this conversation, a legitimate appreciation of Pete's talents as an account man. And we can just see how aggressive Ted is here. I mean, he's at the hospital where Pete's child is being born, and he's making a pitch to lure Pete from his job while also glad handing the grandparents. It just shows how focused Ted Shaw is. So in a world where I think as a viewer, we're often watching Don Draper be distracted or have these other things that seem to detract from his, singular focus on the job and the company. Ted Shaw seems to be the antithesis of that. All we see of Ted Shaw is Ted working on behalf of the company and pushing. He's a very tough competitor, and he always seems to be on his game and focused.
I find it interesting that Peggy and Pete often both have counteroffers right after they walk away from Don's verbal abuse. I think people are much more susceptible to offers we never would have considered if we feel underappreciated or undervalued. But Pete is pretty solid in his refusal here. And, of course, Ted showing up at the hospital to woo Pete Campbell while his baby's being born, another nod to the conflict between work and personal life in this episode. And another note, we know Peggy had Pete's son in December of 1960, and that baby would be turning 5 a few months from this point. So that's lurking in the shadow for viewers as well.
Part of Ted's pitch is directed directly at Don Draper, too. He says, look, you'll have a full voting third. He says, I'm not Don. This isn't the Wild West. When he says, oh, we have Alfa Romeo, so you'll get an Alfa Romeo to drive. And Pete says, well, I don't know how to drive. And Ted quickly shoots back with, oh, I'll teach you. If you look at Pete's reaction, and we know that the Dykeman Campbells, have a long, waspy, upper class history, I think Pete views it all as a little gauche to be there doing this pitch and a little untoward. So I think there's the compliment and the ego stroke of how desperately Ted wants him. But I also think there's an element of his upbringing saying, this is not proper. This isn't to be done here in this place. So I think you see that duality on Pete's face.
Distasteful, like meeting with American Airlines after your father was killed on their plane crash, like that.
Well, again, I'm not saying that we're not all hypocrites, and Pete Campbell certainly has his share. But the shoe's on the other foot here. So it's Ted who's the one who's being distasteful. That's completely different than Duck and Pete being distasteful.
I do think that's a fair point that there is that combination. And I think Pete does have a loyalty to this company. I think it matters to him that he's a partner and he views himself that way. Pete does seem like he wants to build something. He's been working on his accounts. He's been showing up and doing the work that Roger hasn't been doing. So I think he is loyal to this work and he doesn't want to throw it away and start over.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I also think, we know from Pete's interactions with his father before he passed that his father didn't feel he was up to anything of substance. So if Pete starts flitting around and changing companies, in my mind, I would think that Pete would view that as confirming his father's suspicions and accusations. Whereas if Pete builds something and now they're going through the fires of this trial with the loss of Lucky Strike, but to emerge from that successfully, I think for Pete Campbell, that would be a direct refutation of his father's assertions. So I think you're right. I think he's got this sense of loyalty and commitment to this firm. I also think he's a big believer in Don Draper as a creative talent. I think he feels he's got a winning horse. They're in a tough situation, and he's not quick or eager to pull the ejection handle and run over to Ted Shaw's shop.
In the next scene, Joan lets Roger into her apartment. She did not join him at his hotel. And what is the moment I hate him most for? When he says, "Is that what you sleep in now?" Because you, Roger Judgy McJudgerson, do not get to look down on Joan's blue striped pajamas when you come over unwanted and uninvited and you let the company down, including Joan.
You're being pretty harsh on the little guy here. He's just a kid. Give him a break. And Joan is holding the line here, right? And it becomes pretty clear, separate from the professional misconduct by Roger Sterling, of which professional Joan has no time for. She's now drawing that same line or building that same wall personally. It is over between them. And she makes it abundantly clear in this scene. And we can see Roger struggle to grapple with that realization. She really means it. It is over. We're done. He felt this was a door he could come back to, and suddenly his key doesn't work.
Yes, exactly. That is his take. And this is a quick spoiler, so fast forward ahead just a little bit. Keep in mind, Joan is pregnant, so she's tired for all the reasons anybody else at SCDP is tired. Plus, she's growing a baby, so she is extra exhausted and doesn't have time for Roger's nonsense. And I know everybody will talk about Joan's line to Roger where she says, "I'm not a solution to your problem, I'm just another problem," which is a great line. But I actually appreciate the exchange right before that because I think it's fundamentally the difference in the way they see their relationship. Roger says, "I need you right now." And Joan says, "Because I'm a port in a storm." Like she's Roger's fixer, like you were saying. She makes things easier for him. And he says, "No, because I feel like shit and you care about me." And he doesn't think Joan is having to act like she's somewhere between a mother and a waitress, right? But her years of treating him that way have made him feel really good. And she does get him, and he does love her as much as he can love somebody, but it's not nearly enough. And he does not understand the sacrifices she has made throughout this relationship, where she acts all bubbly and friendly and supports him through whatever it is and doesn't ever saddle him with any of her issues or needs. He hasn't seen that this isn't a real relationship in that way.
Yeah, and that's all absolutely accurate and true, I think. But I can also feel for Roger in this moment. He's turning to the person who best typifies family for him. And it turns out it's this person, Joan, is not his family for the limitations and reasons you pointed out. And this is news to Roger. And I mean, that's a critique of Roger's perceptions and how he's viewed this relationship and all the rest of it. But it still is a rough moment for Roger. Professionally, they're in big trouble. And now personally, the floor is just dropped from beneath him. There's a sad loneliness at the end of the scene when he says, "So that night we got mugged. That was the last time. I wish I'd known that." And that's not a line where he's trying to change her mind or weasel his way back in. It's a statement of resignation and acceptance of the sad truth of where this relationship has come to and this endpoint. As critical as I am of Roger Sterling, I can't help but feel sorry for the character in that moment because finally reality has intruded into his view and the rose-colored glasses are off. And that's a tough moment for anybody.
Yes, I want to talk about that line specifically. And I don't disagree with you that he's not trying to convince her at that point when he says that. Joan has to officially end their sexual relationship here, or Roger will be back for the next crisis or his moment of loneliness. And remember, the last time they broke up after his heart attack, he said, "I'm so glad I got to roam those hillsides." And it cheapened their relationship, but she didn't seem to mind, so okay, so be it. And here, he's looking at her and he's realizing what he's losing, and both of them love each other at some degree. It is a loving relationship. But instead of saying anything about what she means to him, he says, "I wish I'd known that was the last time." And again, it seems so diminishing next to what he feels for her. It kind of doesn't matter because they're not going to be together. So if he says, "I love you," it doesn't change anything. And she probably already knows this about him. And I can also look at this comment and see it as something more about his journey, his aging, about how things go away, like the last time your toddler mispronounces that word in a really cute way, or the last time you saw that friend and you didn't realize at the time it would never happen again. But it is still diminishing because he's centering himself and his journey. He doesn't say, "I'll do whatever it takes to be with you. I'll face my flaws. I'll take more responsibility." She's not important enough for him to do more than he's already doing. And that proves that she's right to do what she's doing.
It's amazing that you can get as deep into your life as Roger Sterling does without really understanding your responsibilities. And I think in this moment, there's an element of Joan saying, you know, you haven't lived up to your responsibilities in a true relationship for us. And that's a major reason why there is no relationship now with us. but it's true in a larger sense for Roger Sterling, and I think that's the real gut punch for him because he has a wife, and he has an ex-wife, and he has a daughter, and he has Joan. And what is the state of his relationship with all of these people? Because again, I think he's right to pick Joan as the closest thing he has to real family. And now to have that door slammed in his face, he's left with, okay, you have no family. And that's just it's rough. And again, we beat this drum all the time, but oh, Betty Draper and she acts like a child. If we're awarding the gold medal for childishness in this series, my nominee is Roger Sterling, and it's not close.
I'll take Don Draper or Pete Campbell, depending on which season. But sure, Roger. Roger definitely has a competitive spot. I think, and spoiler again, sorry everybody with this, but remembering too, Joan's pregnancy elevates her sense of responsibility, I'm sure, right? Because she's preparing for what her life is going to be like, and she knows Greg is away. So I think she has a sense of, if I have to do this on my own and make this happen, I can't be distracted by putting people like Roger first, right? Like she has a new priority now. And
She,
so
she's going to have a baby, so she can't keep the other baby.
she cannot manage the other baby. That other baby is
The old baby.
the old baby is so problematic. Nobody has time for that.
I mean, it's a funny, charming baby, but it's a baby.
You want to go out for drinks with that baby, but you don't want to live with that baby. And speaking of drinks, Don is still at the office very late when Faye comes in. He's honest with her instead of brushing things aside, which I respect. He admits the day was miserable, and we see her caring for him. She discourages him from drinking, and then they have what I think is this really amazing scene. So Don just blamed Pete for losing Glowcoat unfairly, and earlier he asked Faye to watch Sally when she was upset. And he's about to mix his personal and professional life again here as he pushes Faye to tell him about some unhappy clients she knows of. Does that seem over the line to you?
Yeah, because I think he's asking her to do an ethical violation of the trust of those clients who would not, want her sharing any information. And I don't know in the 60s if they had, non-disclosure agreements the way they do nowadays. But at least in principle, or the expectation would be for non-disclosure. And Faye knows that. And I mean, her reaction to him is to cite exactly that ethical point. But at this point, Don's sort of thrown business ethics out the window. And if there's anything that can help him and his firm, he wants that help. As he says, look, I'm drowning here. And a drowning man will grab anything or use anybody. And that feels to me what Don Draper's doing here. And again, I respect the professionalism of Faye to say, I care about you and I'm trying to do everything I can to support you. But my limit is that ethical boundary of, I have an obligation, both legal, professional, and ethical to my own clients. And I'm not going to break that or compromise that just to help you in your moment of need.
I think the important thing is that Don's ask is definitely over the line to Faye, whether it crosses some kind of corporate, officially written rule or not. She's honest, she's angry, and I think she's absolutely right. He should not ask this of her. He knows what she's given up to build her career. She hasn't been married, she doesn't have children. She's had to keep a lot of barriers in a predominantly male space to find success, and he's willing to put all that at risk because he's desperate. And just like Joan and Roger had a fast exchange that clarified their relationship, Don and Faye have one too here. He says, I would do it for you. And I believe he believes he would do it, but I don't actually believe he really would do it. And she says, I would never ask you to. She wouldn't risk it. And I think part of what we admire about Don is his risk-taking and his willingness to come up with new ways of looking at things. Faye is less willing to take risks, and she also has more integrity.
Well, and we can see Faye's perception of the request too at the end when she says, I would never use you like that because I know the difference between us and this stupid office. And clearly that's a line that Don has erased. And again, there's so often in this series, it almost seems to echo some of the discussion between Roger and Joan in the prior scene, where there's a boundary that one perceives as being very important and they're adhering to it, and the other one is trying to erase or cross that boundary. But it feels like Faye is a hard no here. She's given her answer and she's not bending on it.
I also think it's critical to point out Faye isn't breaking up with Dawn, and we can see that because she uses the present tense in this line. She says, I know the difference between what we have and this office. And that matters for what's coming up. She's mad at him, but she says what we have, not what we had.
Yeah, agreed. I don't perceive this as being a breakup of the relationship. The notion that the relationship is terminated in this scene, I don't get that vibe at all. This is a fight. It's on a serious matter, and there are bad feelings between them. But I do not perceive this as a breakup at all.
And when we talk about childishness too, and how Faye represents a more healthy, realistic relationship for Dawn than he's had in the past, this is a real relationship. She's being very honest. She's expressing a reasonable disagreement in the face of his request. He's obviously upset, understandably so. But I think this shows that he isn't ready for prime time in terms of a reciprocal, healthy relationship, because they're having this disagreement and she's honest with him. And, his instinct often is to run away, to bury it, to be evasive. And you can see how uncomfortable it makes him that he can't just order her to do whatever it is he wants. And I also think that is critical for what's coming up.
And speaking of fraught relationships, the next scene takes us to Peggy and Stan. And Peggy is obviously very stressed out. And we know Stan's theory about why Peggy's stressed out and what she really craves and needs in this moment. So he tells her that he's got a technique to take away the nerves and gets her to close the door. We're sort of watching as the viewer thinking he's going to do some sort of breathing exercise or stretching or something. But no, he's really just wants to get with her and thinks that this is the perfect opportunity. And of course, Peggy is having none of that.
At the risk of Joan telling me I'm just a humorless bitch, I don't love this scene. I don't think Stan is charming or funny. He really can't understand why Peggy isn't interested in him, so he keeps up the taunts and the innuendo, including grabbing her, kissing her, thinking it's going to make her realize how much she wants him. No. It wasn't cute when Paul did it in season 1, and it's not cute here either. I do love Peggy's line when she rejects him and opens the door, rolls her eyes, and says irritably, well, thank you, I'm not anxious anymore. So I guess he did help her in that way.
I think the thing that tips it for me to being quite different, say, than the Paul scene in an earlier season is the power dynamic here. Stan works for Peggy, so she's got the professional power. So although Stan's conduct here is unbecoming and not appropriate for the office, if Peggy was his direct report and somehow subjected to him, it would take on a far darker sort of power dynamic. But in this case, where Peggy wields the power, it's somewhat pathetic the way we see Stan acting. Peggy shooting him down yet again. She says, why do you keep making me reject you? And there's a comedic value in that because we realize Peggy is empowered and able to protect her interests, even in the face of Stan's inappropriate conduct, which again comes across to me as more pathetic and desperate than threatening and dark. She's not hurt or upset about this pass from Stan. She's irritated because she's about the work. She's trying to get on with it. And this clown is diverting her from that mission. And she's not going to be diverted.
I understand the distinction you're making with a power dynamic, but it doesn't matter if somebody works for you or you work for them. If they're grabbing you and you didn't want them to, it's not cute. It's not funny. It's not charming. It's not going to make you want to. It did not work for me. Speaking of not working, Roger comes in to officially tell the other partners and Joan that his fake visit to Lucky Strike failed. And he tries to look on the bright side, but we see Dawn again throwing shade in front of other people. He blames Roger, and this time he points to Pete. Dawn points to Pete, and he says, he would have never let this happen. And we all feel the planet shift in a world where Dawn is specifically siding with Pete over Roger in front of Pete. The mood is so ugly in the room, and then Megan comes in to tell Pete, "You have a baby girl," and everybody mutters, "Congratulations." And it reminds me of when Peggy got her promotion to become a copywriter because the room was all tense and awful and in the middle of this great news.
Yeah, we can see the partners thrashing around under the pressure of this situation. We can see Dawn's pent up frustration with Roger. And we can see Roger's reflective reaction that somehow this endeavor they've embarked upon was somehow Dawn's fault and that he was dragged kicking and screaming into it, which isn't really the case. I mean, Dawn made the pitch and Roger went for it. But again, it's so childish of Roger. It's a kind of pathetic denial. At the end of the scene, Bert kicks Roger when he's down with the truth bomb. Lee Gardner Jr. never took you seriously because you never took yourself seriously. And as Matthew Weiner says in the commentary, Bert is kind of a surrogate father for Roger. He saw Roger when he was a child, and then as Roger came to adulthood and joined the firm, Bert was always there as, the senior person who took over that fatherhood role after Roger's father passed away. So this is an especially wounding comment coming from Bert of all people.
I just find Bert really annoying here because he's right. Roger doesn't take himself seriously enough. But it's not very helpful to make that observation at this point. Wouldn't it have been a lot more useful if Bert had actioned that opinion earlier? Because it wasn't like it was a secret that just revealed itself. I mean, he knew this about Roger earlier. He knew that he had one client. He knew that he was going around, and we've seen him make comments casually. But when Bert wants something, we've seen him call Dawn in. We've seen him take action when he wants it, and he just let Roger go off. And now here we all are.
I think Bert is intending to wound Roger here because of Roger's reaction to Dawn's comment. Roger doesn't seem to take any ownership or feel shame about it. Really started changing the subject to, well, I never wanted to be in this adventure in the first place. You dragged me into it. So it's that dodging of responsibility and ownership, I think, that provokes Bert. Imagine a world where Roger hangs his head in response to Dawn's comment and clearly takes it to heart and feels bad about it. I don't think Bert piles on at that. But when he tries to deny and change the subject, I think then Bert comes in as the voice of truth to say, Dawn's absolutely right, and rewords it in a way that strikes home on Roger. And that's what makes it hurt even more is Bert's absolutely correct here. To your point, there's no changing it now or fixing it. What's done is done. But in a world where Roger's still seeming to avoid responsibility, these are the kind of comments that you attract from people like Bert.
Across the office, Peggy's getting ready for her presentation with Playtex. And Stan looks at her and sees she has lipstick on her teeth from when Stan kissed her before. He smirks and he doesn't tell her about it. And in a context where Dawn just had a meeting and told them to babysit clients and be perfect, this seems like a pretty irresponsible play on Stan's part. Not that I'm surprised, but you don't want your colleague going in and being unprofessional if you can support her. So I get he's just playing games and trying to get back at her for rejecting him. So I understand we're supposed to lighten the mood because of all the stuff that's going on with Roger. But still, this is bad, right? Like you need every single client. You can't make a single mistake. It's like when they were getting ready for the American Airlines presentation and they had the menu just right. You don't want your lead presenter with lipstick on her teeth. And he's like, yeah, sure, let's make that happen. Who cares?
Yeah, what have we seen from Stan as a character? He really is a bit of a man baby. So yeah, this is totally par for the course of the man baby. And maybe he doesn't have the power and maybe Peggy doesn't want him sexually, but here's his little assertion of what he can do. He cannot tell her about the lipstick on her teeth and let her go present. So it's petty and small and there's a certain comedic aspect to it. But like you said, it's no surprise that this is sort of how Stan acts in this moment. And I think it's also a direct contrast to Peggy, who, if the positions were reversed, I think Peggy would be very quick to say, hey, you've got lipstick on your teeth, and she would not want a coworker failing to look their best to go make a pitch.
This next scene is so sad to me. We're at a funeral for a guy we didn't know, and ad guys are telling stories about this man in front of his wife and daughter and trying to pretend that his family was the most important thing to him. And who's sitting there? Dawn, who doesn't have a family anymore after taking them for granted, and Pete, whose wife just had a baby and he hasn't gone to see either his wife or that baby yet. Sure, fellas. I mean, the job is making you and your family money, but this ad man fraternity is actively working against your time with your family. Quality time wasn't a phrase back then, but it developed as a response to people who regretted the time they or their parents spent at the office or at their jobs. So, this grim celebration of grinding for accounts in place of being there for family milestones, it's heavy handed, but it is such a cautionary tale, and they don't seem to read it.
I get the sense there's a bit of guilt on the face of Dawn and Pete as they sit there and that they realize how much they parallel David Montgomery's life. And just every cut where we can see the wife and daughter sitting there, with these, I think, largely hollow words from those delivering the eulogies. And you just see how miserable and sad they look. You can't get that time back. And then you've got the people who stole the time while they were alive, lamenting or talking about, how generous it was of you to give his time to us. And again, to your point, well, all for what? What as David Montgomery shuffles off this mortal coil, what is he left except a miserable family? And the ad world is going to go on.
And these are the people who get to tell his story, right? It's not his wife and daughter. It's these people he worked next to. They're the ones who define his time and tell the story and frame up his life. And that seems so unfair.
They might as well have lined up all the Clio awards he won, dust to dust kind of thing. And it would be just equally pathetic and garish to see them and think, yeah, you traded the time with your most loved people to win these little awards. It's a great scene because we realize that Pete and Dawn are there in an ambulance chasing role, right? They're looking for business. So it's like, yeah, David Montgomery's gone. Hey, by the way, are you interested in changing ad firms? Because we see the personal and professional cost of what they're doing.
Back at the office, Peggy gives her presentation with lipstick visible on her teeth, but the clients are impressed. And there's this moment where the client runs his tongue over his teeth at her, and you get why Peggy thinks he might just be a lecherous guy since she's encountered her share of those. But then Harry reveals the truth on his way out of the meeting, which again, you'd think he would be supportive and mention that to her in advance. So she goes into the meeting, she kills it, and she looks at Harry or somebody, Ken, Stan, to give her some kind of approval. I mean, they are bleeding clients. She shows up and did her job well, and all she gets is, "You've got lipstick all over your teeth." Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, it's not clear that Harry notices it before because once she's in presentation, I don't think he can interrupt. And I love Elizabeth Moss's reaction, this sort of eye roll, frustration with, these jerks let me go out there and do this. And again, she's such a professional and a good sport about it. But I just love that sort of nonverbal acting.
Yes, to her credit, she smiles and she can take a joke. She's learned that. And I think we like her so much better for it that we have this moment. And I also thought this was maybe a little nod to the fact that Peggy has come a really long way since her first client, which was Belle Jolie lipstick.
I agree with you. Peggy's come so far. And, in a series where sometimes it's difficult to think who we're rooting for, it feels to me like she's the primary one that I root for because she's got all these obstacles. She takes the high road. She tries to do things the right way. And there's all these other people throwing obstacles in her way. And it just feels like through perseverance and talent and professionalism, she carries the day here. So, she had lipstick on her teeth. But like you mentioned, the presentation was a success. The client was happy. And Stan had his little joke at her expense, and she's not going to begrudge that.
Later, Don is working late and he has a scene with Megan. He sees she has repaired his Clio and she says she'd like to learn more about his work. And isn't that just the way to this man's heart? Roger went to Joan looking for her to build him up and make himself feel strong again. And here's Megan. She literally fixed an award Don was so happy to earn. She brings ice for his drink. She doesn't express any worries for the future. And then she looks up at him and says, "Teach me, wise genius man." I mean, that is every bit of Don's love languages right there.
Yeah, and she's this incredibly attractive, young secretary. So she's ticking all the Don Draper boxes for sure here. And of course, we can see through the scene, Don's feeling that appeal and that attraction, and she initiates it when she reaches out and touches his arm, which is quite a forward gesture and making her intentions clear at this point. And we can see Don's hesitation. He looks at her, they kiss. Don expresses that he doesn't think it's a good idea. Megan reassures him this has nothing to do with work. We can see Don falling here. And then he says, well, he can't afford to make mistakes right now. And Megan gives the final reassurance, which is a reference to his prior admin that she's not going to run out of the office crying tomorrow. She just wants him right now. So to your point, she's hit all his love languages and she's reassuring and allaying any hesitations or concerns he has. At the end of the day, this is Don Draper. All the lights are green.
Yes, Don tries to stop it a couple of times, but he's had a hard day. He fought with Faye, and Don is going to Don. So different girl, different sofa. But sex with the secretary is Don's thing this season. And both Don and Megan know he's with Faye right now. And I really dislike the shade Megan tosses Allison's direction, saying, I'm not going to run out of here crying tomorrow. Girl, check in with some of the women Don has met and let's check your capacity to cry about it then. I mean, she just knows what he wants to hear and she provides that for him, just like Joan did for Roger once upon a time.
In his commentary, Matt Weiner says that in this scene, Megan is not being manipulative or conniving here. I can agree with those choice of words, strictly speaking, but I do feel Megan consciously steers this interaction in the direction she wants it to go. And she makes it clear that she does want him. And, she moves all the pieces in that direction. So I'm not going to call it manipulative or conniving in a pejorative sense, but is Megan acting consciously towards something she wants here? I think, yes, she is.
I agree with that. And I'm not super impressed by Megan's conversation either, backing up. Dawn asks why she liked the Glow Coat commercial, and all she says is she remembers the feeling like the kid in the commercial. It's just not very insightful. And Dawn is ready with condescension too, and this is another contrast with Faye. He would never say to Faye, well, this is a little complicated when he talks about work. He would ask her to compromise her integrity, but he'd at least assume she could keep up.
I'm also going to disagree with Matthew Weiner's commentary where he says Don thinks things are over with Faye at this point, which goes back to that earlier request he had made that she shoots down. And again, I feel uncomfortable disagreeing with the head writer because he knows his characters and where he wants their plot arcs to go. But I just don't see how Dawn could reach that conclusion. Like, that's a convenient conclusion based on where things are about to go with Megan. But I just can't think from my own life or anyone I know would reach that conclusion based on the way that earlier conversation with Faye ended. It wasn't some explosive, that's it, we're gone, door slam or whatever else. It's a hard disagreement that feels like it's not fully resolved and there's going to have to be further discussion. But given the depth of their relationship and the level of intimacy that Don has with Faye, in fact, he shared this secret, which he shared, voluntarily shared with so few. I don't think that in Don's mind, there's any basis for him to think, oh yeah, I broke up with Faye a few hours earlier, so I'm unattached at this moment. I just don't buy that. I think this is Don Draper being Don Draper here versus, oh, I just broke up with my other girlfriend. Maybe I'll get a new one.
I'm also going to disagree with Matt Weiner in the DVD commentary because they have this conversation. We'll have a lot of other things to say about her background, the stuff that she says too. But when Megan tells Dawn she knows everything about him, that he's in her head all day, Matt Weiner says he overheard somebody say that and he thought it was kind of sexy. And I have the opposite reaction. To me, it magnifies the boundary blurring this episode is focused on, that Don's control, his demands, these things loom large for the people around Don Draper. That he's taking up space in their heads all the time. And he doesn't even know where she's from. Or he's a writer and he doesn't know his secretary majored in literature. And Megan is asking for very little. She's asking for the right to compliment him, basically. And I don't find that sexy. I find that a huge power imbalance. And I don't see that in the scene. I see Megan does truly want him. So I buy that. But I don't think having a control freak take up rent in your brain is sexy. That's different.
Just for the record, if anybody's seeking permission to compliment me, permission is granted.
Yes, yes. And at least John does finally ask her some questions about herself. Megan has been here since the Christmas party in this season's episode 2. That was at the end of 1964. Now we're in August of 1965. It's the first time Don has ever wondered where she's from. Megan's French Canadian. She's from Montreal. And she says she's an artistic person, that she does some painting, writing, and acting. And I've always wondered why Megan took that job at SCDP in the first place. Because answering phones and being part of focus groups is not the artistic mecca you might seek out in New York in 1965.
If only there was some way she could get out of that job and pursue the things that she really wants to. Just some path, some vision.
Okay, well, I don't believe that either. I don't really believe Megan when she says she'd like to be a copywriter. She doesn't even use the term. She says, I'd like to do what you do and Miss Olson. And it feels like she's just taking any excuse to stay in his office a little bit longer.
Maybe that's all it is. I mean, it reminds me of that line from Kill Bill where he goes, I must warn you, I'm very susceptible to flattery. Megan knows how to court Don Draper in this moment, and she succeeds.
I think the cut from Megan with Don to Roger at home with Jane is not accidental, knowing what we know. I mean, it's not like Roger found the easy, carefree love with Jane that he kept insisting he deserved, right? But we'll get to that.
Well, yeah, and physically, I like John Slattery's physical presentation as he's sort of tiredly and feeling sorry for himself, walks through the scene and tells Jane that he's very tired and basically he's going to go up to bed. But Jane's got a box and calls him over to show that she has self-published his book, Sterling's Gold, about his life in the advertising industry.
I don't think Jane published it for him. I think the box just came and she opened it. I don't think it was her gift to him necessarily, but...
Yeah, it's self-published. He didn't get anybody to publish it.
Okay, but he did it, right? It wasn't like she went out and gave him a gift of it, right?
I interpreted it as she had made that happen. But that's an assumption, so your point's well taken. There's no clarity to my knowledge. Did he self-publish it and then the book just arrived, so she's happy to present the package to him? I just got the sense that the sort of surprise that she was trying to level wasn't the surprise of, oh, look, that book you self-published finally showed up in hard copy. I got the sense that the surprise was, oh, nobody would publish it, so I went out and got it printed for you. But again, that's my assumption.
Yeah, I took it differently, and I thought, okay, well, I do want to back up, and I want to say Roger cannot have any reason to complain about Jane's sleepwear because she has some sort of gold lame situation that could double for date night. So she is completely ready to go out, I think, in her pajamas. And when she presents Roger with the box, he's wary. He asks, what did she buy? And that is their relationship to him. She spends his money and he sighs about it. And then when she opens the box for him, he sees it's copies of his book, Sterling's Gold, which it seemed to me, every time I watched this, it seemed to me that it was just, he forgot that he wrote this thing and that it was due in the mail, not that it was something she did for him. She was just showing him and trying to be very sweet to him and proud of him. At the very moment Roger has failed his company, now he can look at the printing wrappings on his memoir. He struggled to have anything meaningful to say in that book, just as he struggles with what his job really is.
And after he sought solace in Joan, not his wife. So that contrast is pretty stark because here, we're going to get critical of Jane, or at least critical of the relationship, I think, as things go on. But in this moment, I agree. She's been a great supporter for his. He's really down. She's going to cheer him up with this and really, help him celebrate in this moment. And he's just so full of self-pity that he's just completely going through the motions and, signs just a very generic dedication to her. And we can just see he can't even engage or enjoy this moment of seeing his book in print. He's moaning about all the things he's lost today.
Well, she tells him, I'm so proud of you. At the moment, he's least proud of himself. And he doesn't talk to Jane about all the problems he has at work. They don't have that conversation. And you kind of wish he's not being honest with her because he cares what she thinks about him and he wants to preserve her good opinion. But really, he's not honest because he doesn't respect her or trust her to understand or trust her not to criticize him. So they sit snuggled together, but it's lonely. And Roger gave up his family for this hollow relationship and a story he tells about himself that isn't true. And as much as he he made this particular bed, I do pity him as he's sitting here.
I pity him, but I think I just can't let go of this criticism that Roger has had every privilege and every opportunity, and really more so than almost anybody else. At least Don Draper, Dick Whitman had a terrible childhood. So there's baggage and challenges that poses for him as an adult with some of his poor choices. But Roger Sterling has had life on a silver platter. And if it's come to this place and he wants to know who's responsible, yeah, look in the mirror. John Slattery gives it so much charm and charisma to this character that I think it gives a shine and offsets some of that. But when you peel that glitter away and just look at the substance of Roger Sterling's life and where it's led him to this point, I can't help but sit there and sort of judgmentally shake my head a bit. You've got no one to blame but yourself, Roger.
At the office, Dawn and Megan are pulling themselves together, and he invites her to get dinner, but she cares for him. She says she wants him to go home and sleep and not to drink anymore. I think it's such a missed opportunity we don't get to see Megan's apartment. I think that would tell a whole story.
If
And
it's
she definitely
messy, if it's messy, we know she's very creative. But if it's neat, then she's not very creative.
and Megan definitely seems happy, but like Anna Draper, she doesn't make any demands on him. And I know Dawn is our protagonist, but that male gaze is pretty extreme here. So here we have Faye standing up for her career, knowing his secret identity and client situation. Faye is honest, she's forthright. And over here is Megan, telling Dawn every pretty thing he wants to hear. And she's younger, so it makes it a little bit easier for him to control her. She's not an equal partner. And one is a lot healthier for the man who started swimming and journaling and drinking less. And one is an invitation to his old bad habits.
I wonder if the analogy here is to the booze. Megan is the booze. It's not good for him, but it's an escape, and it's something that he's sought comfort in the past, and he'll seek it there again. Whereas that new clean living Dawn, well, that partner is the Fae who creates challenges and says no to his unethical request, but is actually better for him, and he needs those barriers. It's someone to challenge. And she truly is supportive and a friend. He confided his big dirty secret to her. She didn't run away or judge him negatively for it. She stayed as supportive after the fact. And with Dawn leaning into Megan and booze, it feels like, okay, so then Faye and clean living are the alternative choice, which apparently Dawn has, elected not to go with.
And it's a good thing Don didn't take Megan home with him because when he gets there, Faye is in the hallway writing a note. Don is sighing the way he does with Betty. He's sure this is a breakup. And instead, it turns out Faye got him a meeting with Hines.
And then I think Dawn, it's rather interesting. I would have done it for you. He's all in trying to push her to do it. And now that she's actually done it for him, he's backing off and says, well, you don't have to do this. And Faye reassures him, yeah, I wanted to. And again, I think you do the truth shout outs, but we should do the Don Draper thank you shout outs. And there's a Don Draper thank you here to Faye, which again, we don't have so many Don Draper thank yous in the series to this point.
Faye has really fallen for Don, and here she is just hoping he's going to be worth it. And he's just come from sleeping with another woman. So sorry, Faye. And he isn't even that appreciative because he's so guilty. So as she snuggles up next to him, to Dawn, like Roger, neither man is able to feel proud of himself right now. And we know what a big sacrifice this was for Faye because we saw how angry the suggestion made her earlier. So she changed her mind. She's going to lean into this man who is already pulling away from her.
And as my comeuppance for disagreeing with the creator and head writer of the series, it's pretty clear as he spots her outside his door, he thinks she's writing the goodbye letter here, that she came over to say goodbye in person and the relationship. So now she's writing the termination of the relationship. And of course, that's not what's happened. She set up a meeting with Hines and, basically complied with his request, which, as you mentioned, I think it just compounds this feeling of guilt and shame on his part. And it's created a real quandary here because I think given his actions with Megan, it would be more convenient if she terminated the relationship and really reaffirm his most recent decision. Uh, Now things are much more complicated. And as she nestles into him on the sofa and in a look that's, very reminiscent to Jane snuggling in with Roger in a prior scene, we can just see the shame and remorse on his face as he sits there. And it's like, okay, you've got this tangled web, Dawn. What are you going to choose from here? Because, you've sort of got two mutually incompatible options in front of you.
The closing song is Welcome to My World, performed by Jim Reeves. The lyrics say, "Welcome to my world. Won't you come on in? Leave your cares behind. My world was built with you in mind." Faye and Megan and Anna, and for a time Betty, certainly spent energy waiting just for him with arms unfurled. But Don is too selfish to build a world around anybody else. Except maybe his favorite child, Jean, of course.
In his commentary, Matt Weiner talks about how this episode is about family and where people choose to find it. And as we've seen from the episode, where perhaps family isn't quite where they thought it was. And I think this ties in with Dawn and Faye. He thought that she had ceased to be family, and yet she comes through for him and has to make a pretty big personal compromise in order to comply with his request. But I think it shows the depth of her commitment. And this makes it all the more tragic given Dawn's interpretation of where their relationship was and his subsequent behaviors.
Our listener shout out today goes to MKD, aka Megan. Thank you so much for your 5-star rating and kind review on Apple Podcasts. We really appreciate those 5-star ratings and positive reviews on Apple and Spotify. So thank you to all our listeners who have supported us that way.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctoz.com, to vote for your favorite Sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.